The Thompson family was excited about this new phase in their lives. After months of planning and waiting, they had finally moved into the large country house they had found in a real estate ad. Father James and Mother Linda were especially excited about the idea of a more peaceful life for themselves and their two children, Emily and Daniel. Their new home was an old building with a stone facade and large windows that seemed to look out over the vast countryside around them. As the sun set, casting a golden light over the house, the family began unloading boxes and arranging furniture. The atmosphere was cheerful and full of energy. Emily and Daniel ran around, excited to explore every corner of their new home. James and Linda were busy putting together furniture and organizing the kitchen, trying to make the place a cozy home. However, as night fell and the house grew darker, an eerie feeling began to linger in the air. The light from the chandeliers flickered once or twice, but everyone attributed it to problems with the old wiring. As the family gathered for dinner, a faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hallways. James tried to ignore it, assuming it was just the sound of the walls adjusting, while Linda and the children were a little restless but tried to remain calm. At bedtime, the feeling of unease persisted. Linda looked at James with a doubtful expression, but he just smiled and reassured her, saying it was just the nerves of moving. With one last look at the now silent house, the family headed to their rooms, unaware that their first night in the new house would be the beginning of something unexpected. The first few days in the house passed slowly, with the family getting used to the new routine and adjusting their belongings. The house, although charming, had an air of antiquity that seemed to hide secrets in the shadows. The sun shone during the day, but at night, the atmosphere changed subtly, as if the house had a life of its own. On the third night, Linda was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she noticed something strange. One of the ceramic pots was out of place, turned on its side. She frowned and put it back in its place, thinking that perhaps Emily or Daniel had overlooked it. But her uneasiness began to grow when other small incidents began to occur. The living room light would flicker intermittently, and cupboard doors would open by themselves. As the night wore on, Emily and Daniel began to complain of noises in the dark. Daniel, the youngest, was particularly frightened and said he had seen a shadow moving through the hallways. Linda tried to comfort him, but the worry was written all over her face. James was busy with work and didn't pay much attention to the children's reports, thinking that it was just their imagination or the result of tiredness from moving. In the early hours of the morning, Linda heard light footsteps in the hallways, similar to the sound they had heard the first night. She got up to investigate, but found nothing unusual. The house seemed peaceful again, but Linda couldn't sleep well, feeling a growing sense of unease. The next morning, James tried to downplay the situation, saying that the sounds could just be the wind or the house adjusting to its new surroundings. He urged the family to try not to worry, but Linda and the children couldn't ignore the sense of unease that was hanging over them. As the day wore on, the house seemed quiet again, but the feeling of eeriness lingered, like a shadow that never quite disappeared. Linda decided she needed to understand what was going on and began to investigate the history of the house. Unaware that she was about to discover something disturbing, Linda decided she needed answers and began to explore her new home further. While cleaning out the garage one afternoon, she found an old box hidden behind a pile of dusty books. The box was covered in dust and looked like it had been forgotten for years. Curious, Linda opened it and found several old items: faded photographs, a jewelry box, and a leather-bound journal. Her heart racing, Linda picked up the diary and carefully wiped it clean. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the words were still legible. She began to read the notes, which appeared to be from a woman who had lived in the house many years before. The entries spoke of loneliness, of a life of isolation, and of a deep pain that the author could not share with anyone. The diary described a growing sense of hopelessness and a series of disturbing events that coincided with what the family was experiencing. The woman mentioned feeling a strange presence in the house, and her accounts were accompanied by detailed descriptions of how the house seemed to respond to her feelings of despair. Linda was disturbed when she read an entry that mentioned the woman's desperate need to make someone listen to her suffering. She mentioned that she had tried to talk to her neighbors, but could never get anyone to pay attention. The feeling of being ignored and unheard spilled over the pages. With the diary in hand, Linda decided to talk to James about what she had found. She showed him the pages and explained the similarities between the events described and what the family was experiencing. James, although skeptical, realized that the coincidences could not be ignored. They agreed to investigate the history of the house further, in the hope of finding some rational explanation for the events that were occurring. The family began to search for information in the local library and in old records, while the diary remained a constant reminder of the sadness that seemed to inhabit the house. Linda and James were determined to find out what had happened to the woman who had lived there before them, in the hope of finding a solution to the mystery that was disturbing their lives. As the days passed, the supernatural occurrences in the house became more and more intense. Linda and James continued their investigations, searching through old archives and talking to locals about the history of the house. The feeling of unease in the house seemed to be growing, and the family became increasingly restless. During a particularly quiet night, Emily and Daniel were awakened by a loud noise coming from the attic. James, skeptical that anything supernatural existed, went upstairs to check, but found nothing but boxes and cobwebs. However, when he went downstairs, he noticed something peculiar. An old photo of a woman, which appeared to have been put back in place after being removed. The presence of the shadow, which the children had begun to see, became more visible and intrusive. Daniel was particularly disturbed and claimed to have seen the shadow moving along the walls and hiding behind furniture. Linda tried to comfort him, but she felt a growing sense that something was wrong. Each night, the supernatural events became more frequent. Cupboard doors began to open by themselves, objects moved around, and a sense of being watched intensified. Linda found a new diary entry, which described a similar feeling of being watched and a growing sense of despair. Tensions between the family members increased. James was frustrated, believing that the stress of the move was affecting everyone, while Linda was terrified by the continued experiences. The children were increasingly terrified and refused to be left alone in their rooms. On one particularly frightening night, the family heard a scratching sound coming from inside the wall. James decided to investigate further and, with a little effort, managed to open a small compartment hidden in the hallway wall. Inside, he found more old items, a series of letters and documents that appeared to be from a previous owner of the house. The discovery seemed to be connected to the history they were trying to understand. The letters contained personal accounts and stories that corroborated the sense of isolation and despair described in the diary. The connection to the suffering of the woman who had lived in the house seemed stronger than ever, and the family was beginning to realize that what they were experiencing was something deeply rooted in the house's past. Determined to unravel the mystery, James and Linda spent the day at the local library, searching through historical archives and old records. Among the documents and books, they found information about the house's former resident, a woman named Evelyn Carter. Evelyn had lived in the house during the 1920s and was known for her seclusion and personal difficulties. The records revealed that she had suffered greatly from mental health problems and the isolation forced upon her by the community. Although described as a kind woman, Evelyn faced a growing sense of abandonment and despair. What caught James and Linda's attention most were the letters Evelyn had written but never sent. In the letters, she tried to communicate her suffering and ask for help, expressing deep sadness and a desperate desire to be heard, but it seemed that no one cared enough to respond. An old newspaper article also revealed disturbing details about Evelyn's death. She died alone in her home, after a period of increasing isolation. The article noted that there were notable absences at Evelyn's funeral, and many in the community considered her a strange and distant figure. With these revelations, it became clear that Evelyn's grief had not been properly acknowledged during her lifetime, and her presence was still associated with the house as a reflection of her unresolved despair. James and Linda began to understand that the strange events in the house were a manifestation of Evelyn's mourning, an attempt to gain attention and express the pain that had been ignored in life. Determined to resolve the situation and bring relief to the family, James and Linda began to plan a way to help Evelyn find peace. Realizing that Evelyn Carter's grief was fueling the supernatural events in the house, James and Linda decided to address the situation head-on. The family prepared to hold a symbolic ceremony to acknowledge and honor Evelyn's grief, in the hope of helping her find peace. On the appointed evening, the family gathered in the great hall of the house, the very place where Evelyn had spent the final moments of her life. They placed candles around the room and laid out the items they had found: Evelyn's diary, unsent letters, and other personal belongings. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of reverence and sadness. James and Linda performed a small ritual, lighting the candles and speaking in low voices. They read passages from the letters and diary aloud, acknowledging Evelyn's grief and expressing regret that it had not been heard in her lifetime. Linda, in a firm but emotional voice, apologized for all who had ignored Evelyn and expressed her wish for her to find peace. As the ceremony progressed, the house seemed to respond to the act of acknowledgement. The temperature in the hall dropped slightly and a light breeze moved through the room, as if an unseen presence were present. The shadows that had previously danced on the walls now seemed to dissipate, and the sense of unease that had permeated the room began to subside. At the climax of the ritual, a soft sound, like a sigh of relief, washed over the room. James and Linda felt a deep sense of relief, and the children, who had been watching anxiously, seemed to calm down as well. The family sat in silence for a few moments, feeling a sense of peace they had not experienced in weeks. With the ritual complete, the house seemed to have regained its serenity. Although the experience had left its emotional scars, James and Linda were relieved that they had taken an important step towards solving the mystery and bringing relief to their family. Evelyn's disturbing presence seemed to have found some sort of resolution, and the house was now at peace. After the ceremony, the atmosphere in the house changed significantly. James, Linda, and the children felt a palpable relief, and the tension that had permeated the room began to dissipate. The feeling of being watched and the supernatural events that had plagued them now seemed to have subsided. The house once again had a semblance of tranquility that the family had not experienced in weeks. As the family adjusted to the new sense of calm, James and Linda reflected on what they had experienced. They realized that in addition to facing a supernatural presence, they had faced the pain and suffering of a person who had been ignored and misunderstood for many years. The experience made them realize the importance of recognizing and addressing the suffering of others, not just what was visible at first glance. Emily and Daniel, although they still remembered the fear, were now calmer and were beginning to regain some semblance of normalcy in their routines. James and Linda committed to using their experience to help others in similar situations, knowing that emotional pain and isolation can have profound and lasting effects. Despite the peace that had returned to the house, the family felt a slight sense of vigilance that never completely disappeared. It was as if Evelyn's memory was still present, reminding them of the impact that unresolved grief can have on a house and its inhabitants. Over time, this feeling became a constant reminder of the importance of empathy and caring for the suffering of others. The experience brought them together as a family and left a lasting mark on their lives. They were grateful to have found a way to bring relief to Evelyn and to have regained peace in their new home. The house, now quiet and serene, was a reminder of the power of compassion and the importance of listening to those in pain.